Picture this. A bitter wind rattles the ancient glass of a castle window. The year is 1457, and in a candlelit chamber a girl's trembling hands clutch the edge of her bed. She is 13, her face pale with fear and exhaustion, her body racked by pain that no child should ever know. Outside the world is silent, but inside history is being rewritten by the suffering of a single girl, Margaret Beaufort. This is not a story of royal splendor. This is not a tale of crowns and glory. This is the true haunting beginning of a dynasty, a story of a child forced to become a mother, a pawn in a game of power, and a survivor whose pain would echo through centuries. Before we step into Margaret's world, if you're drawn to the hidden, uncomfortable truths of history, consider joining this community of seekers. Across continents and centuries, we gather to remember those whom history tried to erase. Margaret Beaufort's name is rarely spoken alongside the great queens of England, but her legacy is written in the bloodlines of kings and the silent suffering of countless girls who came after her. Her story is not just about a marriage or a dynasty, it is about survival, resilience, and the cost of ambition in a world that devoured the innocent. Let's begin not with Margaret's agony, but with the world that shaped her fate. England in the mid-15th century was a land torn apart by ambition and betrayal. The Wars of the Roses, Lancaster against York, had turned the kingdom into a chessboard where children were pawns and alliances were forged in blood. In this world, a girl's value was measured not by her dreams but by the power her marriage could bring. Margaret was born in May 1443, the only child of John Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp. Her father was a descendant of John of Gaunt, son of Edward III, making Margaret a distant cousin to the king. But royal blood was a double-edged sword. It made her precious and it made her dangerous. Her father's life was a lesson in the cruelty of fate. John Beaufort had commanded English armies in France only to return home defeated and disgraced. Some whispered that he died by his own hand, others that poison claimed him. Margaret was barely a year old when she became the richest heiress in England, but her inheritance was a curse as much as a blessing. Powerful men circled her like wolves, each hoping to claim her fortune and her claim to the throne. Margaret's mother, the formidable Margaret Beauchamp, understood the rules of survival. She wasted no time in securing her daughter's future. At just 6 years old, Margaret was betrothed to John de la Pole, son of the Duke of Suffolk. The contract was meant to bind two great families, but politics moved faster than childhood. When Suffolk fell from grace and was murdered at sea, the betrothal was dissolved. Margaret was returned to her mother, but her reprieve was brief. In 1455, as the Wars of the Roses erupted in full force, Margaret's hand in marriage became a prize once again. This time the suitor was Edmund Tudor, half-brother to King Henry VI. Edmund was a man in his 20s, seasoned by war and politics. Margaret was 12. The marriage was arranged with cold efficiency. There was no question of love or even of consent. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, the same stronghold where Margaret had spent her childhood. The great hall was hung with tapestries depicting the deeds of her ancestors, but for Margaret it was a prison. She was dressed in finery, she could barely carry her hair braided with pearls, her face painted to look older than her years. She was a child playing at being a wife, but the consequences were all too real. The marriage was consummated immediately. In an age when noble girls were treated as vessels for dynastic ambition, there was no concept of waiting for physical maturity. The trauma of that night would haunt Margaret for the rest of her life. The evidence of its impact was written in her body's permanent damage and in the lifelong religious devotion that became her refuge. Within months, Margaret's body began to change in ways that terrified her. The older women around her spoke in hushed tones, their faces a mix of joy for a potential heir and deep concern for such a young mother. Margaret's own mother watched her daughter's growing belly with dread. She had been 18 when Margaret was born, old enough to survive childbirth. At 12, Margaret was attempting something that had killed countless women older and stronger than herself. But Edmund Tudor would never see his child born. In the autumn of 1456, while campaigning in Wales, he was captured and died in captivity. Some say of plague, others whisper murder. Margaret, now 13, was a widow, pregnant and utterly alone in a world about to explode into civil war. The news of Edmund's death reached Margaret at Lampay Palace, where she had been sent for safety. The messenger arrived on a rain-soaked November evening. Margaret was in the chapel praying for her husband's return when the news shattered her world. Jasper Tudor Edmund's younger brother took responsibility for his pregnant sister-in-law. He brought her to Pembroke Castle, a fortress perched on cliffs above the wild Welsh sea. The journey to Pembroke in the depths of winter was an ordeal. The roads were rutted with frozen mud, the air sharp with the promise of snow. Margaret traveled in a horse-drawn litter, each jolt sending pain through her swollen body. The castle itself was cold and drafty, its great fireplaces barely keeping the chill at bay. Margaret's rooms were hung with thick tapestries to block the wind, but comfort was not the purpose of this place. Survival was. The winter of 1456 to 1457 was merciless. Ice crept across the inside of the castle windows, and the wind from the sea howled through every crack in the ancient stones. Margaret, her belly heavy with child, could barely walk the length of her chamber without exhaustion. Her body, still that of a child, struggled under the burden it carried. The castle's physician, a learned man who had seen both queens and peasants in childbirth, examined her with growing alarm. Her hips were too narrow, he confided to Jasper Tudor. The child was large, the position was wrong. Birth would be dangerous, perhaps fatal. Margaret's world shrank to the flickering light of her chamber. She was kept away from the court, hidden from prying eyes. The hopes of two great families rested on her small shoulders. Every day she was reminded that her duty was not to herself but to the future of England. The pressure was relentless, the fear suffocating. But Margaret was not a girl who surrendered easily. Even as her body weakened, her mind grew sharper. She spent her days reading, learning, and listening. Jasper Tudor, seeing her intelligence and resolve, became her tutor in the arts of survival. He taught her to read faces, to hear the unspoken messages behind diplomatic language, to understand the web of alliances and enmities that governed noble society. Margaret learned that knowledge was her greatest weapon. She also turned to faith with a desperation that bordered on obsession. The castle's chapel became her refuge. She prayed for hours, her knees raw against the cold stone, her whispered Latin prayers echoing in the silence. Some say her devotion was a way to impose meaning on suffering that otherwise seemed senseless, a way to survive what no child should ever endure. The castle's priest, Father Meredith, became another guide. He taught Margaret that God often worked through human agency, that prayer without action was empty, but action guided by prayer could move mountains. Margaret listened, absorbing every lesson, every story of saints and martyrs who had endured the impossible. On a January night in 1457, Margaret's labor began. She had been walking the battlements, taking the exercise the physician insisted was necessary for her health. When the first contraction struck, the pain was like a knife, sudden and overwhelming. She collapsed against the stone, gasping, while her ladies rushed to help her back to her chamber. The midwives, women who had delivered countless babies, exchanged glances heavy with meaning. They had seen this before, a child trying to give birth to a child, nature pushed beyond its limits by human ambition and political necessity. They prepared their instruments and said their prayers, knowing that before dawn one or both of their patients might be dead. Dame Gwenfirk Daffyd, the head midwife, was a woman who had learned her craft from her mother and grandmother, inheriting secrets passed down through generations of Welsh women. She knew herbs that could ease pain, techniques for turning breech babies, and prayers that seemed to give strength to laboring mothers. But as she examined Margaret, her weathered face grew grave. The chamber filled with the smoke of burning herbs, lavender for calming, rosemary for strength, and other plants whose properties were known only to the women who tended births and deaths. For 18 hours Margaret labored in agony that defied description. Her screams echoed off the stone walls until her voice gave out, leaving only gasping animal sounds of suffering. The midwives worked frantically, their hands slick with blood, as they tried to save both mother and child. Dame Gwen used every technique in her arsenal: massage, positioning changes, herbal remedies, and constant encouragement whispered in Margaret's ear. Jasper Tudor paced the corridors outside, his boots clicking against the stone flags, knowing that the future of the Lancastrian cause might die in that chamber. He could hear Margaret's cries through the heavy oak door, each one cutting through him like a blade. Servants hurried past with basins of hot water and armfuls of clean linen, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. Father Meredith knelt in the chapel, praying without ceasing for the young woman whose life hung by the thinnest of threads. As dawn approached, Margaret's strength began to fail. She had been in labor for nearly a full day, her young body pushed far beyond its limits. The physician summoned from uneasy sleep examined her and spoke in urgent whispers with Dame Gwen. The baby was alive but in distress, its heartbeat irregular and weak. Margaret was bleeding internally, her pulse thready, her skin pale as parchment. The decision was made to attempt manual extraction, a dangerous procedure that might save the child at the cost of the mother's life. Dame Gwen had performed the technique before, but never on someone so young and small. She positioned Margaret carefully, praying silently to Saint Margaret of Antioch, patron saint of childbirth. As she prepared to reach inside the young woman's body and guide the baby into the world, the chamber held its breath. When the baby finally emerged torn from Margaret's body in a process that nearly killed her, the midwives held their breath. The infant was pale, barely breathing, covered in blood and birthing fluid. For a terrifying moment, the chamber was silent except for Margaret's labored breathing and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Then Dame Gwen cleared the baby's mouth and throat, and the sound that changed everything filled the air, a thin, angry wail that announced the arrival of Henry Tudor, the future King of England. Margaret, barely conscious, her young body shattered by the ordeal, heard her son's first cry through a haze of pain and exhaustion. She tried to reach for him, but her arms would not obey her mind's commands. Dame Gwen placed the baby on Margaret's chest for a brief moment, the traditional first meeting between mother and child, before rushing him to the fire to be cleaned and swaddled. Margaret's eyes followed the infant with desperate intensity, memorizing every detail of his tiny face. The damage to Margaret's body was severe and permanent. The physician examining her in the days following the birth found extensive tearing and internal injuries that would never fully heal. She would never bear another child. This single traumatic birth had ended her childbearing years before they had properly begun. At 13, she was effectively barren, her reproductive life sacrificed on the altar of dynastic politics. Margaret's physical recovery was slow and agonizing. For weeks she hovered between life and death, racked by fever and infection. The physician tried every remedy: herbal poultices, bloodletting, strong wines laced with medicinal herbs. Dame Gwen never left her side, spooning broth between Margaret's cracked lips, wiping her brow, whispering encouragement when the nightmares came. The castle's priest prayed at her bedside, invoking every saint he knew. But the wounds that cut deepest were not those of the body. Margaret's mind was haunted by the ordeal. Night after night she woke screaming, her hands clutching the sheets, her heart pounding with terror. She flinched from touch, even from those who meant her no harm. Her newborn son Henry was both her hope and her torment. She loved him fiercely, but every time she held him she remembered the pain, the fear, the sense of being torn apart. Yet even as she suffered, Margaret's spirit refused to break. She began to see her survival as a signa calling. If she had lived when so many others would have died, perhaps there was a purpose to her pain. She poured her energy into learning, reading everything she could find, listening to the stories of the women around her. She asked questions about law, about land, about the tangled web of obligations that bound the nobility together. She learned to read people's faces, to sense danger before it struck. The world outside her chamber was changing. The Wars of the Roses raged on, and the fortunes of the Lancastrian cause rose and fell with terrifying speed. Margaret's son Henry was a potential heir to the throne, and that made him a target. Jasper Tudor, ever watchful, kept Henry in Wales, far from the reach of Yorkist enemies. Margaret saw her child only rarely, and then only under the strictest conditions. Each visit was bittersweet, a reminder of what she had lost and what she still hoped to protect. Margaret's second marriage to Henry Stafford was a partnership of necessity. Stafford was a Yorkist sympathizer, but he understood the value of Margaret's bloodline and estates. Their union was more business than romance, a practical solution to the dangers of the time. Margaret retained control of her lands, ensuring her son's inheritance. Stafford provided military protection and political cover. The arrangement was cold, but it kept them both alive. Through these years, Margaret became a master of survival. She cultivated relationships with women on both sides of the conflict, understanding that female networks often outlasted the shifting loyalties of men. She wrote careful letters, sent coded messages, and built alliances that would serve her in the years to come. She learned to hide her true feelings behind a mask of piety and obedience, to speak in riddles, to listen more than she spoke. Her faith deepened, becoming both shield and sword. She found comfort in the stories of saints and martyrs, in the rituals of the church, in the quiet moments of prayer when the world outside seemed too dangerous to face. She gave generously to the poor, founded chapels, and supported scholars and priests. Her piety became legendary, but it was not the piety of submission, it was the faith of a woman who had survived the impossible and refused to be broken. As the years passed, Margaret's reputation grew. She became known as a woman of unshakable resolve, a survivor who could not be cowed by fear or adversity. She was respected by some, feared by others, but ignored by none. Her influence extended far beyond the walls of her own household, reaching into the highest circles of power. But for all her strength, Margaret was haunted by the memories of her lost childhood. She never forgot the pain of being forced into marriage, the terror of childbirth, the loneliness of exile. She carried these scars with her, always a silent testament to the price she had paid for survival. In 1461, everything changed again. Edward IV won a decisive victory at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest engagement ever fought on English soil. The Lancastrian cause lay in ruins, its leadership scattered or dead. Henry VI fled to Scotland, Margaret of Anjou to France. Margaret's son Henry remained in Wales, a living symbol of hope for the defeated. Margaret's marriage to Stafford provided some protection, but her position was always precarious. She developed an elaborate intelligence network, paying servants and merchants for news from Wales, bribing clerks for copies of royal correspondence, doing everything possible to stay ahead of potential threats. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but it kept her son alive. In 1469, Stafford was wounded fighting for Edward IV. The injury left him partially disabled and increasingly bitter. Margaret nursed him through months of painful recovery, using the time to shift his political loyalties. She never directly advocated for the Lancastrian cause, but she planted seeds of doubt, shared stories of Yorkist corruption, and gradually convinced Stafford that his service had been inadequately rewarded. By 1470, when the Earl of Warwick began his rebellion against Edward IV, Stafford was ready to switch sides. Margaret watched these developments with intense interest and growing hope. If Henry VI could be restored, if the Lancastrian cause could triumph, then perhaps her son could return from Welsh exile. She began to reach out carefully to other Lancastrian sympathizers, testing the waters for a potential uprising. The restoration of Henry VI in October 1470 seemed like a miracle. Edward IV fled to Burgundy, while Henry VI was led from the Tower of London and formally restored to his throne. Margaret attended his restoration ceremony at Westminster, seeing for herself how feeble and confused the Lancastrian king had become. But the restoration was short-lived. Edward IV returned from exile in March 1471 with Burgundian support and a small army. The decisive confrontation came at Barnet, where Warwick was killed. 2 weeks later at Tewkesbury, the Lancastrian cause died forever. The death of Edward, Prince of Wales, and the mysterious disappearance of Henry VI ended the direct Lancastrian line. Suddenly, Margaret's teenage son became the most viable claimant to the Lancastrian succession and one of the most dangerous people in England. Jasper Tudor, recognizing the immediate threat to Henry's life, made a desperate decision. He would take the boy into exile rather than risk capture and almost certain execution. The decision was heartbreaking but necessary. Staying in Wales meant death, but exile meant abandoning everything and everyone Henry had ever known. On a storm-lashed night in September 1471, 14-year-old Henry Tudor boarded a ship at Tenby and sailed into 14 years of exile in Brittany. The departure was hurried and dangerous. Yorkist forces were closing in on the last Lancastrian strongholds in Wales. Henry and Jasper had perhaps an hour's warning before enemy soldiers arrived at Pembroke Castle. Margaret was not present for her son's departure. She was in England, unaware that her child was fleeing for his life until days later. When the news finally reached her, the shock was overwhelming. She had spent 14 years separated from Henry by the breadth of Wales. Now they were separated by the English Channel and the hostility of nations. She had no way of knowing if she would ever see him again. Standing on the Welsh cliffs, in her imagination, wind whipping her cloak around her body, Margaret faced the possibility that she had just lost everything that mattered to her. Her son was gone, possibly forever. Her cause was defeated, its leaders dead or scattered. Her own position was increasingly precarious as Edward IV consolidated his victory and began settling scores with his enemies. But Margaret was not a woman who surrendered to despair. If she could not be a mother in the traditional sense, she would be something else: an Tyrelia strategist, a survivor, a woman who would spend the rest of her life working to put her exiled son on the throne of England. The grief of separation transformed into cold, calculating ambition. She began building networks of support throughout England, identifying nobles who might be persuaded to support her son's eventual return. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but it gave her purpose. Margaret became a master of coded letters, secret meetings, and whispered promises. She learned to trust few but to inspire many. Her marriage to Henry Stafford ended with his death in 1471, freeing Margaret to pursue her ambitions more openly. Now approaching 30 and twice widowed, she faced a crucial decision about her third marriage. She could have chosen safety, marrying some minor noble who would protect her estates and leave her alone to grieve her lost son. Instead, she chose power. Her third husband was Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of the most politically adept nobles in England. Stanley was a master of the game that had destroyed so many others. He specialized in backing the winning side at the last possible moment, switching loyalties with such perfect timing that he always ended up on the correct side of any conflict. His family controlled significant military forces in northwest England, and his political connections reached into every level of society, from the royal court to the merchant guilds. For Margaret, alliance with Stanley meant access to intelligence networks, political influence, and military resources that might someday prove crucial to her son's cause. For Stanley, marriage to Margaret brought him the prestige of Beaufort blood and connections throughout the nobility. The marriage was a partnership of convenience, but it proved remarkably effective. The wedding ceremony was elaborate by the standards of the time, designed to announce Margaret's continuing importance despite her son's exile. The festivities lasted 3 days, with tournaments, banquets, and religious services that drew nobles from across England. Edward IV himself attended, perhaps recognizing that it was better to have the dangerous Margaret Beaufort where he could watch her rather than operating from the shadows. The marriage arrangement was complex and carefully negotiated. Margaret retained control of her Beaufort estates and the right to pursue her son's interests. Stanley gained a wife whose intelligence and connections complemented his own political skills. Both understood that their partnership was based on mutual advantage rather than romantic love, a pragmatic solution to the challenges they faced. Together they navigated the dangerous final years of Edward IV's reign, surviving purges and political upheavals that destroyed many of their contemporaries. Margaret used her position as Stanley's wife to gather intelligence about royal policy and to maintain communications with exiles and potential supporters. Stanley provided cover for her activities while building his own power base for whatever conflicts might come. Meanwhile, in Brittany, Henry Tudor was growing into manhood in exile. The Duchy of Brittany was technically independent, ruled by Duke Francis II, but it was caught between the competing pressures of France and England. Henry's position there was precarious. He was valuable as a potential ally or bargaining chip, but also dangerous as a focus for English opposition to Edward IV. Letters between mother and son became even more infrequent and carefully coded as the years passed. They used false names, invisible inks, and elaborate codes to communicate. Messages were hidden in seemingly innocent correspondence about trade or family matters. The system was cumbersome and unreliable, but it maintained the vital connection between Margaret's intelligence network in England and Henry's court in exile. Margaret lived with a constant fear that her son was dead, killed by assassins sent by York, or simply claimed by disease or accident in a foreign land. The not knowing was perhaps worse than definitive tragedy would have been. She developed an elaborate system of informants who brought her news from Brittany: merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, anyone who had seen her son or heard news of his welfare. The intelligence network Margaret built was extraordinary in its scope and sophistication. She had informants in royal palaces, merchant guilds, monastic houses, and noble households throughout England and the continent. Information flowed to her through a web of secret communications that would have impressed professional spymasters. She knew about troop movements before some commanders did, heard court gossip before it reached the king's ears, and monitored the health and loyalties of potential allies and enemies. Edward IV died unexpectedly in April 1483, leaving his 12-year-old son Edward V to inherit the throne. The king's death was sudden but not entirely surprising. He had lived hard, eating and drinking to excess, and his health had been declining for years. But his death at age 40 threw the kingdom into immediate crisis, since a child king required a regency that could easily become a dictatorship. But the boy king would never be crowned. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power in a coup that shocked even the violence-hardened nobility of England. Young Edward V and his brother Richard disappeared into the Tower of London, never to be seen alive again. Richard III was crowned king in July 1483, but his reign began under a cloud of suspicion that would never lift. For Margaret, Richard's usurpation represented both terrible danger and unprecedented opportunity. Richard's seizure of power had destroyed Yorkist legitimacy. Suddenly, Henry Tudor's distant claim through the Beaufort line began to look like a viable alternative to a king widely suspected of murdering children. Margaret began to plot with breathtaking audacity, working through Bishop John Morton and other exiles. She coordinated a rebellion within England while arranging for her son to invade from Brittany. The conspiracy required perfect timing, extensive financing, and communications across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Margaret's letters became lifeless, carefully coded, entrusted to only the most loyal hands, and filled with both hope and warning. The first rebellion collapsed in October 1483 when betrayal exposed Henry's planned invasion. Margaret watched in horror as her co-conspirators were executed. She escaped death only because of her marriage to Stanley, but was placed under house arrest and stripped of her titles. But Margaret was not defeated. Even under arrest, she continued plotting through coded letters and trusted servants. She spent months planning not just her son's return but his successful reign as king. When Henry finally invaded at Milford Haven in August 1485, Margaret's patient cultivation of the Stanley family paid its ultimate dividend. At Bosworth Field on August 22, 1485, Richard III died fighting in the mud of Leicestershire. The Stanley forces positioned to support Richard instead turned on him in a betrayal Margaret had orchestrated through years of careful manipulation. Her son was King of England. After 28 years of separation, 14 years of exile, and decades of patient planning, Henry VII had triumphed. Margaret became the most powerful woman in England, but she never again enjoyed the simple relationship of mother and child that had been stolen from her by political necessity. Margaret lived to see her son establish the Tudor dynasty, marry Elizabeth of York to unite the warring houses, and father the prince who would become Henry VIII. She died in 1509, just days after Henry VIII's coronation, having completed an arc of ambition that began in the blood-soaked birthing chamber at Pembroke Castle. But the cost of Margaret's success cannot be measured in crowns or titles. She sacrificed her body to give England a king, her motherhood to political necessity, her personal happiness to dynastic ambition. The 13-year-old girl screaming in labor at Pembroke Castle could never have imagined the woman she would become, the king's mother, the founder of a dynasty, the woman who ended the Wars of the Roses through maternal love transmuted into political gold. In Westminster Abbey, where Margaret Beaufort lies in her tomb of black marble, visitors can read the Latin inscription that summarizes a life of extraordinary achievement built upon extraordinary sacrifice. But they cannot hear the echoes of that long ago scream, the sound of a child in agony bringing forth the future of England. That sound and the story it began remain buried in the stone walls of a Welsh castle, where the Atlantic waves still crash against the cliffs, and the wind still howls through the ancient stones, carrying whispers of a girl who became a queen mother through suffering that no child should ever endure. Margaret Beaufort's story is not just a tale of royal intrigue or political maneuvering. It is a story of survival of a girl who endured the unimaginable and transformed her pain into power. Her life is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the strength that can be found in the darkest of times. She reminds us that history is not only written by kings and conquerors, but by those who endure, who hope, and who dare to change the world. If you believe stories like Margaret's deserve to be remembered, join this community. Share your thoughts, your questions, and your own stories of resilience in the comments. Let's keep the memory of the forgotten alive, because every voice, no matter how small, can echo through history.